The project section of your resume is the likeliest to be skipped over by both the recruiter and the interviewers. But if you craft it correctly, it could really add to your resume. And in today's video, we're going to talk about what makes a really good project section. But first, we're going to remind ourselves what is the purpose of your resume, because your project section needs to be adding to that purpose. First thing that your resume does for you is it paints a picture very quickly of who you are. And that helps the reviewer immediately determine if you're a good match for the role that they're hiring for. The second reason to have a resume is to guide the conversation with your interviewers, because once you sit down at an interview, they have reviewed your resume a little bit more in depth, and they're going to ask you very specific questions about, your prior experience, maybe your education, or the projects that you've done in the past. If the recruiter cannot tell very quickly that you're a good match for the role that they're hiring for, you will likely be skipped over in favor of another applicant with a more clear and to the point resume. This means that the purpose of the project section on your resume is really no different. It is adding to the picture of who you are very quickly, and the goal there is to get a call back and then to guide the conversation with your interviewers. And in some cases, you might want to consider removing the project section. If you have enough work experience that speaks for itself and you don't have a lot of outside of work projects that would add to your resume, then just remove the section altogether. It is not a mandatory section. On the other hand, if you're brand new to the field and don't have a lot of work experience, or you're trying to switch fields, let's say from embedded software to web development, the project section could really make or break your resume since you're lacking the work experience. Projects to list in the section include personal projects that are relevant to the job you're applying to. Unpaid projects done for others are always great to list. And school projects that are complex, relevant, and unique. Do not list school projects that we're going to talk about in the next section of this video. All right, now the projects not to list on your resume. Anything from the tutorial, hell, if you just followed a tutorial and did not really get into debugging or solving any complex issues and digging deep into the documentation, making design decisions and all of that, it's not really a good project to list. Tutorials do not represent what your day-to-day work is going to be as a software engineer. Next one is school assignments that everybody else had to complete in your class. Don't list those. They're not impressive, they're not unique, and they're not challenging enough to be on your resume. 60 other people have done the same assignment, and they have also posted it on their resume, and they're applying for the same job. It really doesn't make you stand out in any way. Just don't do it. And lastly, I would avoid listing any projects that you did as a team where you didn't do much. You know what I'm talking about. There's always somebody that didn't do much for a team project. If you're one of those people, just don't do it, don't list it, because they might ask you some very in-depth questions, and unless you have a great understanding of what exactly transpired, I just would avoid that altogether. Don't do it. I also recommend avoiding listing stale projects on your resume. What do I mean by stale? Well, stale projects are the ones you've done some time ago and you might have forgotten all the details. So in order for you to list one of those projects on your resume, you might want to revisit it, make some changes to it, and really refresh your memory on it. Otherwise, I would leave it off your resume. But let's say you have the luxury of picking a fresh project to put on your resume. How do you do it? In this case, I actually recommend working backwards by first going to career sites and finding top 3 listings you're interested in, then taking notes on the requirements and the qualifications that they have posted there, and then choosing your project based on those to kind of fill some of those gaps that you may have. For example, let's take a look at the front-end engineer at Stripe. HTML and CSS experience, JavaScript frameworks like React or Angular. Then they're looking for some server-side APIs here. And this is going to be very different in contrast, for example, to embedded software engineer at Tesla. And here we're going to see that they're looking for firmware development in C, RTOS. They're looking for proficiency in Python. So you kind of get the idea that these listings are very different. If you are trying to build a project based on the jobs that you're applying to, you really want to start here before you go ahead and pick your project. Fortunately, there are some projects that kind of have that overlap and are applicable for most software development jobs. Like, for example, knowing Git is probably going to be widely recognized by most companies. Learning the basics of CI/CD, just about every company is going to be using some sort of CI/CD, whether it's Jenkins or GitHub Actions. So understanding at least one of them is always a good idea. Also, understanding how to host your source code, for example, being very familiar with GitHub. So if you build a project around GitHub Actions, that's going to look really good on your resume, regardless of the job that you're applying to. The next part is often overlooked, but is super essential. Like, realize that people who are going to be looking at your project are not going to spend hours digging through your repository of code and trying to figure out what it does. The presentation matters. It's a good idea to make your project very easy to understand and review. This means writing a really good README. This means making a video presentation. This means putting together some GIFs and screenshots and so on. Like, you want the project itself to be very difficult, but anybody looking at it to understand easily what you've done there. In a perfect world, you also want it to be relevant to the exact job that you're applying to. A perfect project is going to be very difficult to implement, but very easy to understand for somebody looking at least at a high level. If you want a really great project that stands out a lot to anybody reviewing your resume, you want something in production. You want something that's actively running and being used by users. And it doesn't have to be thousands of people. It could be just 3 people relying on your code. The reason this is important is because that's actually what you're going to be working on in real life software jobs. Having a live project will really showcase that you understand software development lifecycle at least a little bit, because you will still need to manage, bugs and feature requests and provide some support for your project and think about security and updates. There's just so much more that goes into running a live project, even if it's very small user base, than having a project that just sits there on a shelf and nobody uses. And all of that ultimately makes your production projects way more impressive than any other project. Ultimately, projects are not just about the code. As software engineers, we do a lot more than just writing code. We write documentation, we record presentations, we organize projects, plan upcoming features, prioritize bugs, look at logs, debug unfamiliar code, participate in code reviews, train junior team members, communicate complex ideas, conduct interviews, and so much more. Like, oh, the joy of software engineering. And the code is actually a very small aspect of that. And as you grow in your software engineering career, you will write less and less code and will do more other managerial type of tasks and helping other software engineers get unstuck and that kind of stuff. If you could showcase those skills on your resume through the project section, that kind of levels you up right away. Saying like, oh, this person understands way more, like they get it. Like, it's not just about the code. Sometimes I see people listing hobbies on their resume, and I would probably not do that. Instead, I would say if you have the luxury of choosing your project, you could maybe combine that with your hobby. So for example, maybe you like snowboarding. You could build a project that is revolving around snowboarding in some way. And if the interviewer is not into snowboarding, they can at least appreciate the technical aspect of your project. If they do share the same hobbies, then that's even better. Okay, tips for actually listing your projects on your resume. Remember that this section will go definitely below your education and work experience sections. This is going to be the last section of your resume, and the style and size does matter. You want to make it very readable and consistent with the sections above. So what I would do is I would make your projects as similar looking to your work experience as possible. So you'll have a title that says, my projects, and then you will have a descriptive project name and then a date next to the project name, and then you'll have like 2 bullet points for that project, maybe 3 at the most. And the bullet points should be very similar in style to your work section. And I'm not going to go into how to write a good bullet point. There's going to be another video about that. Lastly, I want to say that your project section is another keyword opportunity on your resume. If you're lacking certain keywords, like this is how you could fill that gap and start a project that uses a tech stack that you're targeting in your job applications. If you made it this far in the video, I think your project section is going to turn out amazing, and I wish you the best of luck in landing the job you really, really want.